preemptive welcome to anyone who hasn't joined us yet, not that they'll see it yet, and a welcome again to everyone that is here. Thank you so much for being a part of this and for joining this and other conversations. I'm really thrilled today to have our guest, Carl Zimmer, here with us. He's a renowned science writer. He's at the New York Times. He's frequently contributed to The Atlantic, and National Geographic, Time, and Scientific American. He's won the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences Science Journalism Award. He teaches science journalism at Yale and is the author of several wonderful books, including Life's Edge and this new one that we'll be talking about today, AIR-BORNE, The Hidden History of the Life We Breathe. So welcome, Carl, and thank you everyone for being here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Great. We're going to start off with a conversation with me and Carl. We'll be talking about some of the things in the book that are particularly relevant to the practice of biomimicry. We'll do that for about a half an hour. You're welcome to be chatting away and posting your questions and getting ready during that time. Our staff will be watching the chat and I'll be able to pop in and out. And then the second half of the time, we'll really just have an open conversation. Usually the amount of people here and the amount of people ready to contribute is pretty commensurate with people going ahead and speaking up for themselves. So if you'd like me to ask your question, you're welcome to do that. Request that in the chat. Otherwise, I'll call on you. And once the conversation gets going, you can really pipe in and really treat this as a conversation. We're around many different tables across a very wide area, but we are all at this one digital table, and it's great to feel that way. So without further ado, I will give a little bit more intro and we'll begin here. So this new book of Carl's is AIR-BORNE, and it explores life in the atmosphere, which is a biome that people don't often think of, and which science has spent a long and torturous path to try to understand. And it's really only, as you find in the book, in the recent decades that we've really come to a more robust understanding of the extent to which life and living material is throughout the atmosphere and billowing around us all the time. For biomimicry, that means there's a real wealth of fresh strategies and unknown functions that are out there that have been going on that we just haven't been paying attention to. So hopefully this conversation can lead us to begin to explore some of those and to give us paths to further inquiry and greater innovation and application. So there we have it. So Carl, let's start with the scale. I think that's one of the most striking things that you have to come to grips with this book. How much life is in the air?
There's a lot. That's the short answer. But yeah, the more detailed answer is we only have a very rough idea of how much is out there, partly because the atmosphere is so big, and partly because we really haven't paid enough attention to it. But when I talk about life in the air, I'm talking about the things that you can see, like, you may see a bird flying past your window. That's fine. Birds are great. I love birds. But there's just so many other things there. And just to give you a sense, like, of just how much we don't understand about it, let's just take insects. So you may be familiar, again, with maybe a dragonfly zipping past you, but it's only been in recent decades that scientists have actually started to appreciate that insects can move in huge numbers through the sky, miles overhead. You can't see them, but radar can pick them up. And in fact, there's this amazing incident where it looked to meteorologists like there was a huge rainstorm in California, and they got in touch with a weather bug, someone who loves chasing weather storms. And he was underneath this quote unquote storm. He's like, there's no rain. And they're like, really? And they're like, yeah, but there are a lot of ladybugs that are falling to the ground. And what they realized was that this was a vast swarm of ladybugs that was stretching across miles. And it was moving through the night, miles overhead. And more recently, scientists have been looking for insects more systematically. And in China, for example, last year, there was a study setting up radar to look over about a few hundred miles in one region of China. And they calculated 9.4 trillion, that's trillion, insects went over this one area, miles in the air, in 1 year. And so when you scale down to smaller things that we can't even ever see with the naked eye, the numbers just get crazier. So there are bacteria that come out of the ocean and come out off of land. It's estimated that 1 trillion come up every year. And so, and some of them end up in clouds. So like if you see a cloud overhead, there could be 1 trillion microbes in that cloud alone, probably several thousand species and in one cloud. And anyway, I could go on, but that gives you a sense of the numbers.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that. And I was just looking at the clouds and thinking of that, just the fact that that can just change your whole picture of clouds. So these species, you talked about them coming up from the land and the sea. Are there any species that are spending their whole lives airborne?
Not as far as we know.
Yeah.
There is a bird, a swift, that has been recorded spending actually 10 months in the air, but eventually it had to land. It had to come down. When you're talking about something like a spore of fungus, it doesn't have wings to flap. It can stay up in the air. It's basic physics would suggest that maybe they'll stay up for a few days, but that's when you're riding the winds miles in the air, you can go across an ocean in that time.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that you'd mentioned that in the water, microbes could spend years getting from Africa to South America, but airborne, it can happen in 4 days.
Yeah. So these what scientists will sometimes call them highways to the sky, and these highways to the sky let life move very fast and basically increases the rate of mixing. And so, it is possible that, the diversity of life, especially microbial life that you see in oceans, for example, may be, a big driving force of that may be this movement through the air. You can, get microbes from one ocean to another in some cases. And so it's a, the life in the air, scientists call it the AIR-BORNE, and it's the third great habitat of Earth in addition to land and the ocean. But the AIR-BORNE, is coming from those two places, and then it's shaping those two other places as well.
Yeah. So that's, I think, where we start to get into some of the real good fodder for biomimicry, is how do these living things that are maybe at home or born in land or sea getting up into the air? And one of my favorite things from the book was that the story of ocean churn and just how wave action itself begins to birth life up that way. Can you go through that?
Sure. This is actually stuff that's only really been worked out, in recent years. Scientists traditionally didn't really think of the ocean as a source for life in the air. But it turns out that crashing waves, are a really effective way to inject life very high in the sky. And the way it works is that, a lot of the microbial life is right near the surface of the ocean, and because that's where the sunlight is and a lot of oxygen. So you have a very rich ecosystem there of viruses, bacteria, algae, diatoms. You will get some animals in there too, and so it's full of life. And so then when waves come along and they lift up and they start to curl over, and we've all seen that sort of kind of cylinder of air underneath a cresting wave. Well, when that wave breaks, it drives a lot of that air deep down into the water. It goes down several feet as bubbles of air, and those bubbles obviously will start coming back up again. While they are traveling through the water, biological molecules, and including cells and whole viruses and lots of stuff, they are essentially, they're attracted to this air bubble just because of the chemical properties of these things. And so these bubbles will then rise to the surface, and they will have, they will have, cells and other stuff like sort of in their skin as they sort of rise as a dome sitting on the ocean surface. And then that dome pops, and you have little droplets that form and shoot up actually into the air. And if the wind is blowing the right way, they scoop up these droplets and then carry them up. And some of them have living things in them. And so if the wind is blowing inland, you can get living things blowing off the ocean and miles inland. And they can also go up. So they can also be rising up to the clouds. So yeah, so with every wave that you see when you're at the beach, just think about it. There's actually life streaming up into the air.
I love that because, we often talk about the likelihood that life evolved in, tide pools and the ocean, and to think that then how long would it take for it to get into the air or to spread out over the land? And with that simple action, it's instantaneous.
Yes, I mean, as soon as you had life that was living, kind of in the surface of the ocean, I mean, we see fossils of microbial mats that were in shallow water, ocean water, over 3.5 billion years ago. So as soon as you've got that, you definitely have an aerobiome. So the aerobiome is probably about as old as life itself. Originally, it was just things coming out of the ocean, but then life came on land. And the first way that life came on land was in the form of sometimes they're called soil crusts. Basically, these are sort of tough microbial mats, very thin. And you can still see them today in certain deserts where, it's just really dry and really nothing else can survive. But maybe 3 billion years ago, you have to imagine, these mats were just starting to encroach on dry land. Mm-hmm. And we know today that when the wind blows along, it can scoop up some of these mats and lift them up again, miles into the air, and just send them long distances. So
like a whole mat intact?
Just pieces, okay. Just bits, just peeling off stuff. Sometimes there are larger pieces that have been pulled out from some places. And scientists were very puzzled by these things. They actually, in the 1600s and 1700s, people would collect them and be like, what is this? These seem like weird black pieces of paper. And they called them paper meteorites. They would put them in museums, and people just didn't know what they were. They thought they just came from the heavens or something. And it was actually a German naturalist named Gottfried Ehrenberg who looked at them under a microscope and said, there are microbes in here. This was something that came from the earth, was pulled up into the sky, and then fell back down. And he was right. And probably that was how life came on land. That's how the land came to life, is probably these crusts came out of the water and adapted to being in air. And then the wind just sowed them like seeds all across the continents.
Yeah, amazing. Here, I'll plug the rest of this book too. So we're focused a lot on the biology of the activity of life, but so much of it is the story of our human understanding of that. And it goes really wonderfully from ancient times through the Renaissance and the Enlightenment into modern science, and really a wonderful human story of how we've come to know this, and of the interplay of ideas and right and wrong ideas, and the realization that, any of these debates about, science is never settled, and it's always full of very lively and engaged debates that have real impact on human life and success. One of the things that I want to explore then about that move to land is that then once you start to get more complex forms of life on land, there's kind of more advanced strategies that start to take advantage of this like tapping into the wormhole of the atmosphere to spread. So like fungal spore dispersal and stuff. They were great examples that you have of that.
Yeah. So when we think about adaptation to being in the air, I mean, the most obvious example would be a bird, which has evolved from dinosaurs, and they gained feathers, and and then arrange those feathers as a wing, and then could glide and flap. So you can sort of see the adaptiveness there and the evolutionary process there. Bacteria, they didn't have wings, and so if there are adaptations that bacteria have to being in the air, they might be. It's possible that some proteins they make that help them to withstand radiation, ultraviolet radiation, and things like that. Those might be things that might help certain species of bacteria survive in a cloud, for example, as opposed to other species. But that's an area of research right now. But about 500 million, 400 million years ago, plants and fungi together start moving on land. And they're in a real partnership. In some cases, the fungi are feeding the plants are feeding the fungi in exchange. In other cases, the fungi are breaking down dead plants, or maybe they're even attacking them and causing diseases. But in any case, they're partners and they come on shore together. And in both cases, they start to take advantage of the air as part of their life cycle. So, early plants were early plants were moss-like. And if you look at moss today, they will actually grow this beautiful little chamber full of spores, which they will then release into the wind. And these, just everything about this growth and how it is released sort of optimizes their chances of getting up and going far. And then these mosses spores can go unbelievable distances. There are moss spores that it looks like they grew in the moss in New Zealand, released spores, and these spores got all the way to Antarctica and landed on volcanoes there, and then formed little moss mats there. So that's the kind of amazing power that plants had, and so did fungi. So fungi, they make spores too. And they have all sorts of extraordinary adaptations to like get these things up in the air. Like, so some of them, for example, stem rust that grows on plants like wheat, their spores are in these like little cylinders, and basically it's kind of like a cannon. And as water soaks into the spores, they expand in size, and the pressure gets so high that they just blast out. And these spores can travel for hundreds of miles. So I think it seems like these were the first species that really started to adapt to the air as a way to get around.
Yeah. So now we've got life replete in the water, in the air, and on the soil. The last of the elements that we have is fire. And that was another amazing surprise about this book, was the interconnectivity of fire and life, and the way that it relates to life getting airborne.
Yeah. So when you can see evidence for fires in the geological record. When things burn, they leave behind their traces, their ash or their soot, what have you. Even bits of smoke can be preserved. So scientists have a pretty good idea of the history of fire on Earth. And it really seems to really kick in about 400 million years ago, maybe 360 million years ago, in that sort of kind of interval. And the reason is that that you have plants. So plants do a couple different things. One is they give off huge amounts of oxygen. So now you have more of the, of the oxygen you need to start fires. And then you have a lot of plant material. You have stuff to burn. And, lightning would be the spark you needed. There was lightning on Earth ever since Earth formed, but, it probably really never made a fire until there was a good amount of stuff to burn. And it seems like plants really like produce that. And then the age of wildfire began. And the reason that wildfire is important to thinking about the AIR biome is largely thanks to one scientist named Leda Kobziar. She's at the University of Idaho, and she was started as a fire ecologist. She would study how forests regenerate after a fire, and she's looking at all the updrafts coming up from a fire in Florida where she was working then, and she thought, I know that there's a lot of microbes in the soil, and there are all sorts of microbes on these trees, on their leaves and on their bark and so on, bacteria, fungi, other stuff. And she's like, I wonder what's happening to them. And so she kind of rigged up a very crude device with these are small managed fires, and she rigged up a pole with a dish and kind of held it out, as close as she could get. And it turned out that in this hot updraft air that was being stirred up by the fire, she was finding a lot of life. She was finding a higher density of microbes than in the surrounding air, and a higher number of species. So then she got a job at the University of Idaho, and out there they do big fires, big managed burns, huge. You have helicopters flying overhead just shooting flames out to get these fires started. So for her, she's like, wow, this is a great opportunity. So she helped to build drones that were tough enough to fly through wildfires, but also could actually scoop up air and sample them for any cells that might be floating around in the air. And she found even more stuff. Like, it's just this incredible wealth of fungi and bacteria and other species that are getting pulled out of the ground by the updrafts and stripped off of trees and getting blasted up way high in the air. These wildfires create such incredible updrafts that things can go way, way up into the air. And so another crazy number is that she calculates that every square meter of forest in a wildfire will be sending up about 170,000 cells, bacteria, fungi, other stuff, 170 cells every second. So in fact, with all the wildfires that happen around the world, wildfires may actually be one of the most important sources of life in the air.
Wow. Wow. And then once it's up there, that's helping to distribute it over wide-ranging areas.
Yeah, and just
to replenish areas. Yeah.
Right. And I just want to clarify, these are live cells. So even though they're being pulled up by a fire, they're not being scorched to death. The fires are sending up life.
Yeah. That's amazing, because when we're thinking of that in terms of those elements, right? And we think of that as these basic things from which life arises, but then you realize that the ocean and the sea foam that you say is from all of the living material and proteins and everything. If we had a purely inert watery ocean, waves would crash and dissipate foam. That is a sign itself of the extensive life throughout the ocean. So the foaming waves of the ocean, the clouds that we see in the atmosphere, not that there wouldn't be any clouds, right? But the clouds in the atmosphere, the soil itself is all built up from generations of life, and even fire itself depends on life and carries and distributes life throughout. To think of how dependent on life those elemental elements are to be what we know them to be is just so beautifully circular and integrated. I think that's one of the great takeaways from this, is how how much, we think of different kingdoms of life, of land, sea, and air, and just to see it's really all this one great, huge interconnected thing, which we know, but it's always astounding when you find new ways of seeing that, appreciating that. I think before we open it up, I want to get to two last points. One being a great case study that you give, kind of linking all of these stories together of the Pseudomonas bacteria on plant leaves, and how there could actually be a kind of, symbiotic relationship between these ice nucleating bacteria, the plants that they're on, and the weather cycles and everything.
Yeah. So when clouds form, you have lots of little tiny water droplets, and you have water vapor, and updrafts will send some of that water very high in the atmosphere where it's really cold. Now, that water, if it freezes into crystals, those crystals can fall, and then eventually they'll either turn into raindrops if it's warm enough, or they'll just fall as ice or snow. But the key is that they have to freeze up at the top of the cloud, and that's actually surprisingly hard. Even below the freezing point of water can stay liquid. So what you need is a little something to act as a seed, a little nucleus around which water molecules can form. And there are a lot of different things that can do that, but some of the best stuff to do that is biological molecules, proteins, and things like that. And so because there are so many bacteria and other cells in clouds, they potentially play a pretty major role in the weather. And so, when hailstones fall down, when people cut them open, they can detect bacteria inside and other life forms. There's a lot of the raindrops that are falling down around you in a rainstorm will be bringing bacteria and other forms of life down to the ground, because the bacteria is what made them form in the first place. And these raindrops also will actually pick up bacteria as they fall. They will just scoop them up and take them down for the ride. So now there is one kind of bacteria that scientists have been studying for a while, which is particularly good at forming ice crystals. It's called Pseudomonas. And people have studied it, like, can we mimic this to make artificial snow, for example, for ski resorts and so on. But the weird thing is, Pseudomonas lives on leaves of plants, trees, and it just sort of seemed kind of odd that this thing would be so good at triggering the formation of ice. Even on the plants themselves, they will freeze over very quickly if they have these bacteria. And there's a theory that these plants actually welcome these bacteria because they're good for them. Because you think about it, if you have a lot of Pseudomonas growing on you, and you're a plant, and it goes up into the air and gets into a cloud, that cloud, you're basically doing weather engineering. You're getting that cloud to be more likely to rain back down on you, or the forest you're in as collectively. So these plants may be supporting bacteria that create more rain. That rain comes down, and that makes the plants grow more, and then they are able to provide more real estate for these Pseudomonas bacteria to grow on. It's a very provocative idea, and there is some evidence consistent with it, but it's still something that could use a lot more research to really confirm that is actually happening. And maybe there are other species that are doing this too. We don't really know.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Maybe we'll leave it there for now. I mean, this sense that It's a story of hundreds of years of research and billions of years of evolution. And there's such a sense of, and this is the beginning. And now what are we going to discover and where can we look? And so I'd love to, on that note, open this up to this community and start to see, what are your questions and thoughts about the nature of this biology, possible applications to solving some human challenges, what have it. Let's open up the conversation here. You can either use the hand raise if you'd like to keep this organized, or I can just, or you can just pop in if you have your questions. All right. Janine, why don't you go ahead? Be sure to unmute yourself if you're coming off there.
Hi, Carl. This is Janine Benyes, and I'm a little fangirl of yours. You're kind of a rock star to this community. Thanks for all you do, all the deep science communication work that you do. It's amazing.
Thank you.
Could you, could you talk a little bit about the connection between this aerial life and climate change and the severe weather we're having in different places and droughts in some places, and how important is it that we continue to have these life forms helping us regulate the planet?
It's a great question. It's a great question, and I would say that, I mean, they're just scientists have been recently publishing reviews on just this issue, and basically a lot of their conclusion is like, we don't know. We're sure it's important, but we don't know what the answer is to that question because we still know so little about the AIR-BORNE. And it's kind of sad because, like, in the 1930s, these pioneering aerobiologists really envisioned that aerobiology would be like meteorology. So, today we have these magnificent maps of the world's weather systems all linked together, and that helps us not only to understand weather to make predictions, but also helps in terms of preparing for climate change. And we don't have some global map of life, an aerobiology map. That doesn't exist. We see, it's sort of like weather in the old days where you would just like get a reading here and a reading there, and you try to piece things together. And it's really sad. And actually, like, a lot of the book is about how aerobiology really is almost like a cursed science. I mean, people died, or people got just thrown into obscurity. Like, it hasn't gone great for aerobiology as a field, but it's really, in recent years, it really has picked up. And so now it's quite a vibrant area. But I will say a couple things. So one is that, and I if this doesn't directly address your question, let me know, but there are a couple things. So one is, as the planet warms, that is going to change the AIR-BORNE. And so you just need to think, for example, about permafrost in the tundras. And as that melts, there are things that have been frozen in there for thousands of years. A lot of those are viruses, bacteria, so on. Some of that will come out of the ground and into the air. Who knows what will be unleashed there. Another example to give you is a disease that we are dealing with right now, a disease of the air called valley fever. Now, that's caused by a fungus that lives in arid parts of the Western United States and in South America. And before people came on the scene, it just sort of led its life, feeding on material in the ground. Rodents digging burrows would sometimes inhale the spores, and they would actually just have a stable existence with it. They would sort of keep the fungus in check. And then when the rodent died, the spore would kind of hatch, would kind of wake up and would grow and feed on the this dead rodent, and then grow and then just spread its spores into the soil again.
Yeah.
So, but then when winds pick up these spores, they can, like other spores, travel hundreds of miles, and people can inhale them. And if they inhale a big dose, or if they have a weak immune system, they can get a disease called valley fever, which is bad. It basically, the fungus starts to grow. It may start growing your airway. It may grow, into your flesh around your face. It may reach down into your muscles. And there aren't good treatments for it, and it can take years for it to finally do someone in. It's really it's quite bad. And there are definitely cases where spores have flown from Southern California to Sacramento, and it caused 100 cases there. And what climate change is going to do is it is going to expand the arid region in the United States. It's going to create more real estate for this fungus, and it's going to put this fungus closer to more people. And also, the population in these regions is also simultaneously growing. So climate change could very well lead to more cases of valley fever. And that's just one species, just one example of how climate change is going to affect the aerobiome.
Wow. Really important that you're writing this book right now and opening our eyes to the research being done now. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Lily, is that your question coming up now?
Yeah, I could just unmute and ask. I popped it in the chat, but this is kind of similar around climate change and the loss of topsoil. And if we know much about how the loss of topsoil might be impacting the aerobiome and vice versa, if we could utilize this knowledge to potentially positively impact the topsoil over time and return nutrients to the soil.
Well, I mean, certainly as there is soil erosion, all the rich life in the soil goes into the air. And so, and the more dust that you have traveling around, the more potential you have for diseases. These are diseases that, there's research suggesting that, microbes that were living in the Sahara, the Sahel, got blown with dust storms to the Caribbean, where they infected coral reefs and have caused a lot of problems for coral reefs there. It's possible, that outbreaks of meningitis in Africa are spread by dust storms as well. So soil erosion is not it's not good for us in terms of how we are altering the aerobiome. It's hard to think about how we might. It's hard to think of how we might be able to sort of address that through the AIR-BORNE itself, just because the aerobiome just contains such a vast number of species, and they're just on the loose. It's not like you can say, like, you go over there, you go over there. There are definitely programs that people are trying to develop on a smaller scale to sort of make cities healthier by, altering the kinds of microbes that are growing, in parks or other in gardens and so on. That's on a local scale. But yeah, soil erosion, that's going to take, dealing with climate change and better soil conservation. I'm thinking, maybe there's something I'm not seeing.
Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I see Dave. Dave, you have a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for talking with us, Carl. I'm curious, how far up have we observed life, and is there any evidence or any reason to think that it might be leaving the exosphere and maybe life is already being shared interplanetarily?
Yeah, in the book, it's a great question. In the book, one of the sort of threads, one of the narratives is about this exciting quest to just see how high you can go and find life. And it really sort of followed the development of different ways to get up high. And so, in 1860, you have Louis Pasteur who's sort of holding flasks up over his head. I mean, that's about as well as he could manage. He even climbed a glacier to see if they were up there, and he would find them. But then you have, the development of airplanes, and then you have early aerobiologists who are flying around in biplanes, basically holding petri dishes out at the side. Charles Lindbergh and, and Anne Lindbergh helped out in a flight they did over Greenland. And then you start to have balloons that start going up into the stratosphere. And, in, I guess it was 1934, I guess it was the first discovery that life could survive in the stratosphere. And that was made huge headlines. And people did start to ask this question, like, how high can we go? I mean, does life go all the way into space? Because already in the stratosphere, that is a rough place to survive. Ultraviolet radiation, cosmic rays, no water, and these things are viable. They're not dead. There's not a lot of them, but the fact they get up there is incredible. So in recent decades, there was a Soviet missile that got rocket, I should say, that got shot up, and the researchers who looked at it when the payload came back to Earth said they thought that they were finding life about 40 miles high. There's a lot of skepticism about that in the community. Like, they think, maybe that was contamination. But certainly there have been probes sent up, balloon probes sent up, and other types of probes sent up by NASA and other places in recent years. So it's about 25 miles up. You can find life as high as that. But yeah, I don't think like a bacterium alone could survive going from one planet to another, but maybe if it was nestled in a meteorite, it could. And it also raises questions about, if there's life on other planets, maybe we should be looking in the clouds. Some people think that Venus could potentially harbor life in its clouds, even if the surface of Venus is too hot for life to survive.
That's wild. Harvey, good to see you. Why don't you follow up here?
Yeah, Carl, I've spent some time recently looking for better metaphors to reach more people around climate issues. And typically when there are metaphors that involve wildlife, they tend to be things like the elephant in the room, or the 3,000-pound gorilla in the room, the Lion King, etc. I'm wondering if is there a metaphor, a particular example that would be recognizable and easily understood by people, what you're talking about with the air biome, to help people to understand what's going on with the climate?
It's an interesting question. I'm not thinking of anything in particular having to do with climate and the aerobiome specifically. I think that I do think that it is a, the reality of the aerobiome is a powerful thing in terms of making people think about our connections to the rest of the world. Even something like the air, which I would bet most people think is just sterile, is actually full of life, and we are not separate from that. We are a part of the air. And it's not an exaggeration. It's like, the air inside of our lungs is, is continuous with the atmosphere all the way to the stratosphere. And every time we breathe in, we are breathing in. If there are organisms floating in the air, usually there are, we are going to be breathing those in. And likewise, when we are sick, when we may exhale viruses or bacteria or fungi or other sorts of things, and be mixing that back into the aerobiome. So I don't know if I have a good metaphor for climate in particular, but certainly like a way of thinking about our connection with nature. I think the aerobiome is a pretty powerful one.
Great. Thank you.
Mhm.
I see now Aaron's got a question. Aaron is working with us on a new collection on microbial life. So I'm excited to see where this one goes. Go ahead, Aaron.
Great, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Carl. It's been really inspired by your work for a long time. I've been working in the area of microbial biotechnologies for 15 years now, and I'm now working in translating this work into biomimicry. And I think that just acknowledging microbes as, you know, our planet's oldest and arguably most successful organisms, there's just a ton of potential there.
Yeah, I agree.
And honestly, coincidentally, just in the last few weeks, I've been working on translating the mechanism behind these ice nucleating bacteria, and really fascinated to learn that, you know, these proteins are co-evolved at, you know, in all kinds of different organisms, and are currently being used, you know, inactivated bacteria just for making, you know, fake snow at ski resorts, as you mentioned, you know, just spraying these proteins in the air. And so it's really made me realize that, you know, we should be studying, but maybe even utilizing these kinds of microbes for climate solutions. You know, could we be doing cloud seeding in a way? You know, I know it's a little bit far off and has all of the same challenges with geoengineering and all of those, but as a, you know, natural potential, or even better, if we could mimic this with a protein that's not just spraying microbes into the air. Just wondering, you know, as you were writing this book, did that occur to you? Did you come across others working in this space of using microbes in the air or their structures to start thinking about future climate change applications?
I hadn't, and you know, I think I don't want to, you know, speak on behalf of all these aerobiologists, you know, and maybe, you know, in their spare time they like to think about this stuff, but certainly there hasn't been a lot of stuff published. You know, I mean, you know, certainly, like, you know, we're familiar with using, say, bacteria, you know, in you know, on land or in the water for things like bioremediation, all sorts of other things. And some people have suggested, you know, fertilizing microbes or other organisms in the ocean to draw down carbon dioxide. Like, but those are in the realms of the ocean and land. My guess is that, you know, maybe the thing is that the air, the atmosphere is just so big, and so, you know, we're not the density of life is lower, and it's going in all sorts of different directions, and also things are just kind of visiting. You know, we're here for a few days, and so it's just you know, it's just like, it's kind of like, you know, trying to put a leash on a cloud. Like, that may be beyond our ability to control, possibly. But like I said, like, the closest that I've seen to these kinds of attempts to shape the air biome are in these projects, you know, in cities, where, you know, you can sort of influence on a small scale the kinds of microbes that are growing, and you know, might be able to get things to be growing that are beneficial to us. You know, there's really interesting studies. I could talk about this a little bit more. There are really interesting studies that suggest that the kinds of microbes that might be growing, say, in a forest, they're different than the ones that are growing, like, you know, on a soccer field, or, you know, on a sort of vacant city block with no big vegetation on it. And those can interact with their immune systems differently. There's even some pretty out there experiments where mice are exposed to the dust from air from, like, you know, a eucalyptus forest versus a city, and their behavior changes. That the ones who are exposed to the forest dust from the air are less, seem to be less anxious. So this is all very preliminary, but really tantalizing work. And so, maybe on the scale of an individual city, you might be able to do stuff to the aerobiome, but once you get past that, it's really hard to deal with, which is tough because another big issue is not just human health; it's the health of our food. Wheat, coffee, all sorts of different crops can be wiped out by life coming down from the air. The Great Hunger, the Irish Famine, that was caused by spores coming on the wind and creating a potato blight. Nobody has really figured out how to stop that. All they've been able to do has been able to breed, some resistant varieties. Of course, then the pathogens evolved to get over that resistance. Some people have, there are attempts to track the spread of these things over continents like weather. But, some people think like, well, maybe we need to just sort of change the way we farm so that we just have to live with these things. And maybe we could just make them less destructive by growing a mix of different varieties of crops instead of just having these big monocultures.
Yeah, there's a line I love in the book, Carl, talking about that kind of that diversity is really the key, as opposed to finding the perfect monoculture that will be free of all pests or of all pests. And it said, we must resist the dream of total victory over these particular assailants, if you will.
Yeah, the Green Revolution did bring a lot of food to a lot of people, but it also came with a lot of downside, and it certainly did not stop evolution. So, Norman Borlaug, the architect of the Green Revolution, one of the things he was trying to stop was this stem rust I was talking about that can attack wheat farms. And I read a lot about that in the book. And at the end, it looked like he had won. And then close to the end of his life, a new stem rust emerged, and he was trying to get people to be aware, like, hey, we need to deal with this again. Otherwise, there's going to be many, many countries that are going to be dealing with this for decades to come. And unfortunately, this particular kind of stem rust has just been spreading since then.
Yeah. Oh. All right. Well, we're just about at the top of the hour. So if you have any final comments or questions, please go ahead and put them in, raise up your hands, post them in the chat. And I know we have one that we missed from Camilo earlier. Camilo.
Carl, one thing that I'm fascinated by just from hearing you is that it seemed like we just were neglecting the aerobiome, as in we were looking at things really based on sight for a long time, and then we were neglecting something that is full of life and full of a lot of interactions. Do you think in all of your research, especially culturally, it does seem like we have this predisposition for sight because it's our most advanced sense as humans, but maybe that's also what was limiting us to understand how much was out there. Do you think that that's part of like our issue with kind of like wrapping our head around such an incredible set of interactions?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's really interesting to look at. Let's look at history, and so Louis Pasteur in the 1850s developed this idea that that there were germs floating all around us, and he believed this would explain how it is that things are being decomposed and breaking down all over us in the natural world. That's a really good thing. He also believed that would explain why things, fruit and other things spoil and turn bad. It's just like we're just surrounded by these spores and germs and all the stuff that's always like settling down all around us. And so he tried to demonstrate this, and it was a very public debate he was in. There were other people like, no way. The only explanation is that if in the potato famine I mentioned, you know, the potatoes started to rot, and then that potato blight organism just spontaneously formed from the potato itself. And the pastor was like, no, that there was some spore for that life form that gave rise to it, and you know, cells beget cells. There is no spontaneous generation. But while he's trying to like prove to people that there's germs around us, there was a journalist actually who said, "The world in which you want to lead us is too fantastic to believe." I just love that line. And I would say that, like, even today, when we have lots of tools at our disposal, you know, scientists can catch things from the air. They can sequence their genes. They can put them under incredibly powerful microscopes and so on. I don't know how much that's penetrated, because like when I just casually, you know, talk a little bit about what's in my book, people say, "Are you kidding me?" And I'll be like, no, I'm not. Actually, this is all very well documented. So I think we still have a hard time believing in this world that surrounds us.
Yeah. All right. I think we have time for one last one. So Aaron, you kind of had a question about that, how to think of this in terms of its relationship to the rest of life that we know of.
Yeah, basically, just to reiterate what I put in the chat is, do you or should we be thinking of the air as a discrete ecosystem to be studied on its own, or is it merely a medium of transport between other ecosystems?
It seems that aerobiologists are increasingly treating the air as an ecosystem of its own. It's unusual because it's an ecosystem just full of visitors, but nevertheless, it does seem like you know, the species that are in a cloud are not just a random assortment of what came up from the ocean or the land. It seems like some species do better in a cloud, for example, than others do. Some may be able to get up to the stratosphere and then survive and be able to come back down and still reproduce. And so, yeah, so it is to some extent, it is increasingly being seen as its own ecosystem.
Oh, amazing. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thanks for all these fascinating questions and insights into this world. Carl, thank you for joining us today, for being game for this kind of specific lens on this beautiful tome that you put out. And thank you for the work that you did to tell this story, to reveal both the human history of it and the biology that is out there. We're really, really excited about it. And we have a special treat, kind of encouraging everyone to get on the Hive and really use this as a place to continue the conversation. Continue posting your questions and ideas. I'd love to see what ideas you might have for things you'd like to see profiled on AskNature. We would love to do a whole AIR-BORNE collection. So let's get some ideas of what are the strategies that are out there. Carl has done a lot of work scratching the surface, but as you can see from this, it's disparate and it's out there. There might be information that's hidden and buried in other work that's already been done that's just not surfacing. I'd love to see what people can get. And we have a treat in that they've offered us some copies of AIR-BORNE to share with you. So get out some ideas. We'll take the first several great ideas that come up there. We'll build some AskNature content on it, and we'll get you copies of the book. So thank you everybody for joining us. Stay tuned. We have, this is the latest of our monthly conversations, but we'll have more. We have Ray of Hope guests, Ray of Hope entrepreneurs that are coming on. We have philosophers of biomimicry, other scientists of all stripes. It's really a wonderful series that we've got planned for you this year, and ongoing conversation around here. Thanks for joining us, Carl. Pop into the Hive anytime with your own questions or comments. And with that, thank you, everybody, and we'll see you again soon.
Take care.